and the well-being of others, because everyone's mental health matters. Our guest in the last show, Poppy Jaman, OBE, an internationally respected mental health advocate, national policy advisor, and social entrepreneur, shared her work creating a culture of mental health and building a global community, influencing change and stigma. You can listen back to this on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel, alongside finding further mental health information on my Twitter feed at AtiyaAli3. We won't be taking live calls within the show today. However, we welcome your comments via the WhatsApp messaging number on 07440 420 432. We have two guests joining us on the show today. Shanaz, a mental health nurse trainee, who has kindly agreed to share sensitive information about her experiences of surviving domestic violence and abuse and the impact on families. Our second guest, Rahmanara, who we will introduce later, will be sharing information about her research on domestic violence and abuse in UK Muslim populations and information about her book. We look forward to speaking with Rahmanara in a short while. Firstly, I would like to welcome Shanaz to the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing show. Thank you for joining me today, Shanaz. As we have shared in your introduction, you are a survivor of domestic violence and abuse. Thank you again for agreeing to share what you feel comfortable to share with us today. Hello, Shanaz.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello.
Thank you for joining us, Shanaz, today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Good evening to all. Just like to share my story as a survivor, not as a victim, because I have survived and I have come a long way. My main domestic abuse was about controlling. I was being controlled all the way through for 22 years. When it was first happening, I was very naive. I didn't even know what the word domestic abuse was until my eldest child, she went into do her A-levels, and then I decided to do a bit of voluntary work. And as a community health trainer working for the NHS, and then gradually building on from there, I was working with women, especially with Asian women, with barriers to language barriers. So I started supporting women, and then off by chance, I had a client and she had herself domestic abuse issues. So I asked my manager that if I could have further training. It's when I sat in my training, the training was from the police and the city council members. And they said there was around about 20 health trainers in that room at that time, and they advised us that this is a very, very sensitive topic. So if anyone wishes to leave the room now. I held on to my breath and I said to myself, if I leave the room, my colleagues will know that I'm being abused. So I actually stayed in that room for 2 hours, sat in the training, ticked every single box in my head what was happening to me. That was an eye-opener, thinking, oh, is this what domestic abuse is? So every time it happened, I noted everything in my head, how to control myself, what is happening to me, what is his end goal. That went on, as I said, for a very, very long time. I was controlled, but there was financial control. There was no contact with family members. I didn't see my parents or my siblings for 5 years. I had no face-to-face contact, no telephone contact, nothing. And that was very, very disturbing for me, because at that time I had my son and I needed my mum. But I wasn't allowed, and they weren't allowed either to come and see me. That was a very, very difficult period. I suffered with perinatal and postnatal depression, mild symptoms. Of course, he wasn't aware of that because I was covering everything up. The health visitor used to come and say, how are you? Everything fine? And you say yes, with a smile on my face, saying yes, everything was fine. As soon as she walked out the door, I thought, if only I could really tell you what's happening to me. I was very, very scared, very scared to talk to any health professionals, what's happening to me, in the fear that my child will be taken away from me. After that, it came that his parents wanted to meet me and the children. At that time, I only had 2 children. So I agreed. I said, yes, I'll go. And that was only for 4 weeks, he said. I said, yes, 4 weeks is nothing, Instead of 4 weeks, I actually stayed 10 months in Pakistan. I had no money on me. Everything I had to, whatever, if I needed anything, I had to ask. And that asking came with a lot of hesitance. Should I ask today? Should I ask tomorrow? Should I ask? Should I not ask? It was really, really getting tough for me. To the point that I actually planned my escape from my in-laws to my uncle's house with my children. They said that we're sorry, what's happened? You come back and we'll let you go back home. I refused. I said, no, if I'm going to go back home to my parents' home, I will go from my uncle's house. And that is what happened. I came back. He came running after. He said, I'm sorry, what's happened? It wasn't in my control, blah, blah, blah. He said, all right, let's put things to one side and let's start all over again. And being a kind-hearted and forgiving person, I said, all right, okay, let's give it another try. Not knowing he had other plans, and he started again, the controlling, the abusing. At one point, it was really bad that he actually dragged me down the stairs when all 3 of my children were standing on top of the stairs and they watched everything happen. It's happened, but the memories still stay with you.
Yeah.
I mean, I've sort of like overcome it, but still, as I said, the thoughts can sometimes just come out of a sudden, out of the blue, and you think, okay, this is a thought, let that thought come, let me fight that thought, and let me start all over again. I mean, I am no longer with him. There was a time where I was getting paranoid. Oh no, he might be around somewhere. Shall I go out of the house? Shall I not go out of the house? Shall I use a phone? He might be recording. But saying all that, alhamdulillah, I have overcome my fears with the support of my family and my friends. I never sought professional help due to the fact that my children will be taken away from me. And I sacrificed a lot to be with my children to get where I am today.
Yeah.
I have been in the West Midlands for 10 years. And in those 10 years, I have 3 children. They are with me. They're all adults now. My eldest one, she's a law graduate. My son, he's doing his chartered accountant after he's done his 4-year degree. My youngest, she is doing her 2nd year policy economics.
Fantastic.
I myself, I am studying my passion and my dreams. I've always wanted to do my nursing. I am doing mental health nursing now. There is always that light at the end of the tunnel. It is difficult to pluck up the courage and say enough is enough. I could not say enough is enough only until when my mum passed away. I needed a shoulder to lean on. He vanished. He was nowhere to be seen. I took the initial step. I said, enough is enough. I took that initial step. I applied for a divorce. It was my right. I spoke to my children about it, that this is what I am thinking of doing. They said, Mom, we have seen everything and we are with you. We are happy that you are taking this step forward now. So I took that step and I am living I am in a happy place. I'm in a very peaceful place at the moment because I do not have this shadow watching me every move that I make. Yes, it takes courage, time to make that decision, but once that decision is made, it is for the better.
Thank
My
you. Sorry.
my main message today is to anyone out there listening that it is not acceptable for anyone to be abused physically. Neglect, emotional, mental abuse is not acceptable no matter who you are. There is support out there, there is guidance out there. It's just a matter of taking that step. And believe me, I'm a survivor of 22 years. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely, Shanaz. Shanaz, during your time of need, who was there to support you? Where did you seek your support from?
My biggest support were my friends when I had them, because I had no contact with my family or my siblings. So my friends were there. They supported me, they guided me. But because I wasn't strong enough, I didn't believe myself. I had lack of self-esteem, I had lack of confidence. I just lost my identity basically, because everything I done, it was wrong, it wasn't right in his eyes. So he always belittled me, saying that's wrong, that's not right. I get angry because you make me angry. So I felt that I wasn't who I am now. It was whatever he said, I said yes, yes, yes to everything. I didn't have a say in anything. So my biggest support were my friends. And then when I decided to move into the West Midlands, it was my family and my siblings.
Mm-hmm. So for the most part, were you in Pakistan or in the UK?
No, I was living in England. I was
Mm-hmm.
living in England most of the time. I am a British born citizen. But as I said, due to him controlling my mind, I just did not know a way out. I did not know of my rights.
Yeah. Shanaz, it's great to hear that you've come through the other side, and like you said, that there is light at the end of tunnel, and your story hopefully will encourage others to seek that support should they need to. I just wanted to ask you quickly about family and the impact on children.
Yes, it does have an impact on the children, because not did the children see what was happening to me, it actually happened to them as well. They were being abused physically, mentally, neglect, control. So it does have a big impact on the children's mental health. Luckily, I was there to support my children. My
Mm-hmm.
children have come out very strong. They've said to themselves, that life was then, let's put that to one side. This life is now. But I am sure deep down inside, they must have, on a very quiet day, some flashbacks, or the thoughts might come into their heads. But it does have a big impact on children's mental health, and it's very important to seek help at a very early stage.
Absolutely. And again, you're saying there that seeking support at an early stage will be is really helpful and beneficial in terms of. Would you like to share why you think that's it better to seek support earlier?
In terms of children to rebuild their lives, not to suffer for that long, not be traumatized, because this is a trauma. If a child suffers through that, for a very long period, how are they able to move on with their lives? How are these children able to trust others? How are they able to go and speak to someone, have the courage to speak to someone, saying that I need some help in this, or I need some support, I need some guidance in this?
It sounds like you've done a fantastic job in bringing your children out of that situation, and in the here and now you're moving forward in terms of your career, education, and as a family. What brought you into mental health nursing?
Due to lived experience, I have to say, especially due to perinatal and postnatal, having mild symptoms and having that fear that my child will be taken away from me. But coming into mental health nursing, I've learned a lot that there is support available for the mother and baby. You know, there are mother and baby units where the child is with the mother. So the fear of, no, if I speak up, my child will be taken away. No, that will not happen. That will not be the case. So we need to, you know, have more education, more awareness, more workshops out in the communities, that anyone who is suffering with either perinatal or postnatal or even domestic abuse is, please open up and seek guidance and seek help and support. Speak to the ones who have that lived experience.
Yeah. And Shanaz, I remember prior to the show today, you've had some conversations around wanting to be one of those people who can support others in coming through domestic violence and abuse, and I look forward to talking to you about that a little later. Also, Shanaz, we have Rahmanara with us today, who might be able to kind of dispel some of the myths that you've mentioned today. So, Shanaz, thank you for sharing your story. Do stay with us. You might have some questions a little later on in the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We will now move on to Rahmanara. Our guest Rahmanara has a master's in psychology and has previously worked with survivors of domestic violence and abuse. She's currently completing her PhD at Brunel University London, where she has been awarded the ESRC funding to research wider issues relating to domestic violence and abuse within the UK Muslim population. She is the author of Kawamoon, I want to say, I hope that I've pronounced that correctly. She's the author of Kawamoon, Protectors and Maintainers and Road to Recovery, both published by Taha Publishers. Rahmanara is also a lecturer in Islam and pastoral care at the Markfield Institute of Higher Education. She often delivers workshops and training in domestic violence and abuse, spiritual abuse, and mental health. Rahmanara, hello, assalamu alaikum, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Salam. Thank you for having me today.
Rahmanara, could you tell us a little bit about what brought you into choosing this PhD topic?
Yeah, so
Sorry,
go on.
No, I'm just wondering whether you'd worked in similar fields.
Yes, so actually, just going on what your previous question was saying, it was experiences like that that actually motivated me to continue working in this area. So previously, I used to work in a counselling capacity with Muslim female survivors of domestic violence and abuse. And I was doing both one-to-one therapeutic work as well as group work. And it was from that I basically went on to develop a faith-informed recovery program, which is now available as a book companion to the program, which you've just mentioned. And yeah, so it kind of, one thing kind of led onto another. I went back to university to retrain, and then was introduced to the idea of doing a PhD, and it just feels like this is the path that Allah guided me down, really.
And you say retrain, were you retraining in psychology or?
Yeah, so I just wanted to upskill myself a bit more. I knew this was the area I wanted to work in. So I went back to do my master's in psychology. And then it seemed a lot of the times I was asking myself, how can I make an impact in this area? How can I help people's lives in a positive way? And it felt like actually going to the source of the problem and exploring the problem itself and understanding it better was the way to do it for me, really.
Right, so this experience led you to choosing the topic of interest you're mentioning there. Did you kind of seek any community advice around the topic before you decided that this was the topic you were going to kind of follow through?
So really, it was more the women that I'd already worked with, and absolutely amazing women, like you've seen from what Sister Shanaz was saying. She, so brave of her to come on and share her experiences, and I can tell that it's still quite challenging for her. And it's amazing women like that who I've worked with, and it was that drive, knowing that actually, if I can facilitate a voice for anyone who's suffered in that way, then it almost became like a bit of a responsibility. And when I looked around in the community, I found that actually people weren't talking about it enough. So again, that was a bit of a motivator, that actually we need to be talking about this issue. And if there's a role I can play in that, then inshallah, that's what I'm going to try and do.
Yeah. You say people weren't talking about it in the community. Was it when you spoke about the subject, or was it just generally there was a lack of talk around the topic?
Yes, just generally people, so this was probably going back in 2012, 2013 time when I first started sort of doing more work in this area. And generally at a community level, these discussions were very rare. There's a bit more discussion going on now, but there's still a lot of work to be done. But at a community level, you couldn't really speak about it that openly. It wasn't being addressed in like mosque platforms, for example. Imams didn't know much about it. Even now, there's still, like I said, there's still a lot of work that needs doing, but people are a bit more open to talking about it.
Uh-huh. So we're kind of talking eight years later, and things are changing, you feel? And I suppose you'll tell us more about that a little later.
Gradually, it is small steps, but I think every step definitely counts.
Okay. So in terms of speaking to communities about kind of the idea of the PhD, how did you come about doing that? How was the topic of interest then sold to find that funding? And I'm sorry, I mentioned the acronym earlier, but I don't know what it stands for, which is ESRC funding.
Yeah, ESRC funding, yeah, that's right. So I'm actually on a specific programme at Brunel University, London, where they've got a partnership between the Open University, Brunel University and Oxford University. And so they make sure that they have a collaborative kind of approach to how they train their doctoral researchers. So alhamdulillah, I was fortunate to apply for that and actually secure a place on that. And when I started my research, what I found was that actually people were really keen to talk about this issue. So in terms of, I won't go into the technical details of my studies, but one of my studies involved speaking to survivors, and I interviewed 10 survivors, and they really wanted that platform where they could have their voices heard. One of my other studies was with professionals who had worked with either survivors or those who perpetrated abuse. And again, they were Muslim as well. They were from the Muslim community, apart from one individual, but he'd had like over 20 years experience working with the Muslim community. And again, it was the same thing of that voice hadn't had a platform before. So they really wanted to get their heard and their experiences heard so that it could be shared more widely. So yeah, it was a good response, alhamdulillah.
Right. It sounds very interesting in terms of the work that you've carried out and gone on to begin, and you'll tell us more about it after the break, I'm hoping. So we have come to the break. We're going to take a short break, and we will catch up with Rahmanara on the other side of this break. Speak to you shortly. Welcome back. You're listening to Atiyali on the Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing show with my guests, Rahmanara Chowdhury and Shanaz. We were speaking to Rahmanara prior to the break with regards to the research that she has begun. Rahmanara, is it okay to tell us a little bit more about kind of previous findings in this field? Was there much research already in domestic violence and abuse, and in particular from Muslim communities? And I'm thinking about UK based in particular.
Okay, so when I started my research it's nearing 4 years ago now, I actually found very little in the field, particularly around the Muslim community. On a very general basis in the UK, we have a lot of research around how domestic violence and abuse manifests. So you might have heard of things like the power and control wheel, the cycle of violence and similar things like that. But actually, when you explore those a little further, you find that they're all based on the sort of white Caucasian community. So there's very little in terms of theory to show what's happening within other minority communities. And in terms of statistics, there was just, well, I haven't come across anything basically. Right. There is research around South Asian communities, but again, it kind of groups South Asians together. So again, it's not specific enough. I know you mentioned UK, but just to say that across the pond kind of thing in the US, there's a bit more. There's some good work by Julian Hammer, who's done a book called Peaceful Families. They've got a project called Peaceful Families, actually, and they've done some really good work. The one thing I will say is that when I have done my research, what I found is that the UK is actually at the forefront of defining domestic violence and abuse. So from a legal perspective, because it's recognised the way it is, it means there's more options in terms of legal options for survivors to pursue. Although that's still a difficult route, it just means that actually if the law has recognised their experience, that means it can have that label to it and there are viable paths for them to pursue. And other countries are actually lacking in that. So that's definitely one plus. But in terms of the Muslim community, there was just nothing. And even till now, there's very limited information of how it occurs and, you know, what the patterns are and what kind of interventions are therefore suitable.
So is this what your study is now focusing on? I mean, I think you said you're at the write-up stage of the study.
Yes, so inshallah, I'm hoping to submit this summer. So yes, my study was basically to explore, well, how does it actually occur in the Muslim community? What are the patterns? What are the trends? Is it the same as the white Caucasian population and other groups, or are there differences? So that's what I was trying to basically identify.
Okay. What role does faith have in the domestic violence and abuse? I'm thinking about those who use faith to sometimes manipulate and using domestic violence and abuse in terms of, you know, using it as an excuse. Apologies.
So actually, this is one of the reasons why I went into this area as well, because what I was seeing was that the ladies who I was working with, they had gone through all the mainstream services. And the one thing they just weren't having addressed was their faith-based needs. So they were getting support in terms of their psychological and emotional well-being, you know, financial and physical safety and all of those kind of issues. Right. But in terms of the questions they had around their faith and whether it was acceptable and what does it mean for them as a Muslim female, you know, what does it mean in terms of their identity and what they've been led to believe about how they are as a Muslim. So they would have been put down a lot. Those questions weren't being addressed. So that was one aspect. And secondly was when I was looking at how the faith was used, it almost became where those who were perpetrating abuse they almost positioned themselves in a way where they became God in that family, basically. That's the only way to say it. Because everything focused around them. And as we've heard from Shanaz, you know, everything is about that one individual and it has to be in accordance to what they want. And that comes over and above their faith. So then basically, when you think about that, that person they're almost, so the perpetrator is almost competing with God. And, you know, we know what that means in terms of Islam. You know, we're not labeling anyone here, but in terms of the implications, you know, that's not a great position for someone perpetrating abuse to be in. But equally, for someone on the receiving end of it, that's not a healthy position to be in either. And there's a lot of suffering involved because, you know, we're not created to worship people. We're created to serve Allah. And it caused the survivors I worked with, it caused them a lot of anxiety because their faith was so genuine and so, you know, it meant so much to them. But equally, it was being destroyed because they had to focus on this one person. And it was very much about the whims and desires and moods and all the rest of it of that one person perpetrating the abuse. So that's one element. But the other element, which I found within my research, is that actually faith was one of the strongest factors that survivors utilized in order to leave the relationship. Obviously, I'm not advocating for the breakup of marriages. However, where you've got a relationship like this, where it is completely unhealthy, and people need to leave for their own well-being, their safety, their their mental health, their psychological well-being. Faith was the one thing that helped them, because they were able to grasp a good understanding of, actually, they're not here to serve a person, they're not here to suffer in silence. The idea of patience, what is patience? Is to do as much as is within your capacity, and then leave it to Allah. So you take action first, and then you trust Allah and leave the rest to Allah. So utilizing all those tools, and having, for example, imams say to them, you don't have to put up with things like this. There's nothing in the faith that says that you have to put up with this kind of abusive behavior. Having friends who said the same thing, coming across resources in books and talks and other things, really encourage survivors to utilize their faith to both leave the relationship, but also to use it as part of their recovery afterwards as well. So you can see, I wouldn't say it's a double-edged sword, but it was misused by those perpetrating abuse, and then utilized by survivors in order to move forward.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you, Rahmanara. Personally working in mental health and speaking to people about domestic abuse in many different areas of mental health, and you don't often hear the positive side of friends supporting individuals, the positive experiences of the imam, allowing people to understand that that's not what Islam encourages.
Yeah.
So did you have that aspect at all in your studies? Was there the
other? So there was the presence of both. Basically, you had key individuals within the lives of survivors who unfortunately also misused the faith to persuade survivors to remain in the relationship as a kind of religious obligation. But then you had other people who came along and said, actually, no, it's not a religious obligation. If anything, you're actually doing the one perpetrating the abuse, you're doing them a favor, because by you leaving the relationship, it means that the dhulm that they're enforcing onto you comes to a stop, or at least it's reduced. So actually you're doing them a favor, because that means there is less on their accountability now when they have to stand before Allah and answer for what they've done. So it was very much about the power of communities. And yes, whilst communities had the power to almost continue that cycle of abuse by persuading survivors that they have to remain in that situation, equally there were other members of the community and other members of religious leaders and imams who were saying that actually no, that's not the right thing, and you shouldn't have to suffer like this. So that became almost more powerful, if you like.
Fantastic. Ramana, you shared earlier that there weren't many figures around UK Muslim population and those who are affected by domestic violence and abuse. Would you say your study is able to kind of add to that then?
So my study has been more qualitative in that I've been speaking to people and finding out about experiences. It's not really measured in terms of numbers and statistics. Okay. I think since within the last 4 years, there has been I've seen more surveys going around, but I don't think there's anything from a kind of national perspective measuring this, but also to just to draw your attention to that actually nationally across all communities, we don't know the true picture, because as Shanaz was saying, it takes a very long time for people to be able to reach out for that support. So there are people suffering as we speak, and it may be years before they actually reach out for help. So we will never have a true accurate picture, both across the wider community and also within the Muslim community. And if you think about how the Muslim community operates, there's a lot more layers of barriers they have to cross before they can reach that support and that help.
Which is rather unfortunate, is it not? And I'm wondering whether your research kind of contributes to removing some of those barriers, or informing of how they could be removed, or is there anything along those lines? Okay, so before we talk about that, I'm just wondering, what did your findings suggest in terms of the mental health impact of domestic violence and abuse on adults, for adults and for children?
So just both in terms of my research and across the board, it's very clear cut that there's both short-term and long-term negative impacts on mental health and well-being. In terms of what you were discussing previously about children, even if children don't witness anything, they are still in that environment. So they pick up the mood in the house. They understand that something's wrong. And this alone, even for very young children, when you look at their psychology and their development, they will be able to absorb those emotions. So actually it impacts them from even a very young age, even if they can't discern what's going on. So just the atmosphere alone will have an impact. And as I said, even if they're not witnessing anything directly, they will still pick up on that atmosphere, and that will have an impact. And you have to remember that we're not talking about normal marital disagreements. We're talking about abusive situations. So you've got ongoing patterns of systemic abuse, and that's what makes it different. And it's aimed at putting the other person down. So there is definite both short-term and long-term negative impacts. In terms of adults, you've got all of the mental health issues that they are likely to face as a result. But also, you see a lot of survivors that have physical health conditions, and that's as a result of the impact on their mental health. So yeah, in terms of that, it's really not a positive thing.
Thank you, Ramona. In terms of the perpetrators, we're talking very much now about kind of a father figure, a husband figure. I'm wondering whether there was coercion and other family members or people that you found were colluding.
Yeah, so actually what I've managed to do at the with my research and the data that I've gathered is I've developed a web model of domestic violence and abuse. As I was saying, in the mainstream kind of population group, a lot of the research only factors in the fact that there's two people in that relationship. But when you look at the Muslim community and other close-knit communities as well, you can't consider just the two individuals in the relationship, because the way close-knit communities are, that it's a network of interconnected relationships. So automatically it tells you that there's going to be something different. And that's what I did find in my research, that actually there are other critical people involved in the whole process. Sometimes they may play a negative role. So sometimes other people were involved in the kind of collusion. So there was actually more than one perpetrator in some cases. But equally in other places, those people, they weren't just static kind of bystanders. They played an active role. They saw what was going on, and they played an active role to kind of support and help and create change. So yeah, you can't just consider the two individuals. You have to look at the wider network of both the physical kind of wider network, but also the network of relationships as well.
Mm-hmm. And this model that you've developed kind of demonstrate the differences in how domestic violence abuse manifests for UK Muslim communities. Is this available as part of your research, or is it already published and out there for access? Or
so I'm just finishing off the final chapter for it. I'm hoping to submit it to a journal, inshallah, in the summer, but I've got to get my thesis in first. So yeah, inshallah, it should be available as soon as I can get it submitted.
Look forward to seeing that. So I'm wondering, when you talk about the web, the model that you've developed there, and the web, would you say that, when there's more people colluding, it's more kind of it lasts for longer, it's more systemic? Did you see a pattern there in terms of?
I'm not sure I can say that it lasts for longer, just because of the way domestic violence and abuse is in its nature, in that it tends to happen over long periods of time. But certainly there's more considerations to factor in. But that means that if you can identify what the kind of vulnerable areas are for an individual, and you can also identify the protective areas for an individual, that means you can look at, well, how do you need to protect them, but also where are their sources of support? So for example, a domestic violence organization could then work with that individual to look at all the protective mechanisms and put those things in place. And even, for example, the police, if they were informed about what they need to, the wider considerations they need to have, then that means their risk assessment would just be a bit more realistic to that person. So inshallah, I'm hoping it will kind of benefit and inform future practice in this area.
Thank you. Ramanara, you've talked a little bit there about kind of the police and other organisations that can kind of support or perhaps in some way provide awareness in the communities in terms of this crime. Would you say, you know, some of these myths can be dispelled? For example, the one Shanaz mentioned, the fear of her children being taken away.
Absolutely.
With some of the work that you've done. Yeah.
So I didn't. So the whole issue around children is actually huge. It is literally like a book or a project in itself, because there's so many factors you need to consider into it. However, I do know that there is a lot of work being done currently with the legal system at the minute to try and raise that awareness, so that people understand that actually there's a huge detrimental impact on children, and therefore we need to put all of those safeguarding measures in place collectively across the whole of society. I think there's still a long way to go, because there is a lot of misunderstanding at a kind of systemic level as well. But the fact that we have got individuals and organisations talking about it is definitely a positive way forward.
You've written an introductory book on the subject of domestic violence and abuse. Could you tell us more about it, the book, please?
Yes, so the first book is called Qawamun. You were right. So it's taken from the Quran, and it means basically protectors and maintainers. So what I wanted to do in that book was basically to write something that was targeted at all sections of the Muslim community, but also individuals, professionals who work with members from the Muslim community, to give them that insight of what kind of goes on, what are the misconceptions, how can they understand this better, and a bit of support for survivors as well within that. So yeah, it's just really introducing the topic, but equally, I mean, when I've written it, it seems quite basic, but then when I've spoken to people who have read it and who don't have an understanding in the area, it really does, well, I hope it does give them a level of awareness that they didn't have before, inshallah.
So you would say that this is accessible and useful to people across the board, not necessarily just the Muslim community?
Yes, absolutely. And I've written it in a way so that it's not academic based. It's more like, you know, you're having a conversation with myself. So yeah, I'm hoping that it will be accessible across the board, inshallah.
Thank you. And the second is it the book? It was Survivors of Domestic Violence and Abuse for the Road to Recovery and Healing from Domestic Violence, right?
So yes, it's called Road to Recovery and then Healing from Domestic Violence and Abuse. So this one was written after I delivered. So if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned about the faith-informed recovery program that I developed and ran. So that was a program that used to run over 6 weeks. And then at the end of that program, so I've delivered it with various groups, actually in the West Midlands and also in London. At the end of those groups, the women actually said to me that they would have really appreciated having something to take away to remind them of what they went through, and in terms of the course and how it can continue to help them in their recovery process. So that's essentially why I wrote the book. It's kind of a companion to the program, the Road to Recovery program. And it goes through, so this one is specifically for survivors, and it takes them through kind of, because if you remember, like what Shanaz was saying, there's a lot of confusion. When you're in survival mode, you can't focus on anything else. You're only focusing on surviving. So what this book, the first thing it tries to do is to clear up those cognitive and emotional kind of confusions, and also the spiritual kind of confusion. So it tries to add clarity to all of those things. And then it takes you through the kind of psychological process of recovery and showing you that recovery is possible. It does happen. Yes, it's a painful process, but it is a possibility. So it's really about providing that kind of holistic support to survivors of domestic violence, really.
Thank you, Rahma. It's been really informative. I was wondering if it was okay to bring Shanaz back in and if she has any questions, because earlier, Shanaz, you talked about wanting to volunteer in the community and perhaps even provide groups like the 6-week program. I wonder if there's room there for collaboration. Shanaz, are you with us?
I am here. Thank you very much for having me again. Yes, I've done my domestic champion training, and I'm also an ambassador for domestic violence champion. So, you know, I just wanted to set some like workshops out in the West Midlands and get the message across to women, young females, anyone who is suffering in silence. Don't suffer in silence anymore. There are people who will support you and guide you in the right direction. So yes, it takes a lot of courage to take that first step. Once that step is taken, you know, there is support. There are trainees out there who will guide you and support you in whatever your worries and concerns are. So workshops definitely are needed for the Muslim community, and more education and how to raise awareness. I think that's the key message that I would like to give out, that, you know, we need to talk more about what are the red flags when you are in a domestic abuse relationship. What are the red flags? How can you notice these red flags? And then you have to decide, okay, there's so many red flags and I need to take that step further.
Thank you, Shanaz. Rahmanara, there you mentioned the 6-week program. Is it, I mean, can anybody provide that program? Do they have to have a certain level of training, or is it something that you yourself carry out? Is it a toolkit for others to use?
So at the minute, it's only been something that I've, because obviously I developed it myself, so it's only something that I've run and delivered. I'm hoping to revisit it and try and produce it as a toolkit so that it can be rolled out to other individuals who want to then run it in their areas. I've just not had the capacity at the minute, but that is on my list to do, inshallah. And I hope to extend it to probably an 8-week program as well, or 8 to 10 week program, because there really is the need.
Absolutely, it sounds like a plan. Rahmanara, I'm wondering, you talk about Muslim communities, and it's perhaps something I should have asked earlier, but was it Muslim population across the board? Did you have people from many different cultures? And was it based on women, and did you find it was women participants that voluntarily took part, or?
So when I did the study with the survivors, I opened it up to anyone who was normally resident here in the UK, any Muslim adult female. And so it was completely open for anyone to come and take part. In the end, I ended up with 9 ladies who were from a South Asian origin and 1 Irish lady. She was a revert. I had 2 reverts, in fact. So yeah, that's just the demographics from the survivors. With the professionals, I had 4 males, I have to remember this right, 4 males and 5 females, but they came from lots of different ethnic backgrounds. You know, there was a lot of mixed backgrounds, but that was a wide range. So the communities that they worked with was actually representative across the board. And the fact that I was getting similar kind of messages, I think that was quite significant in that. So I'm hoping that although there was a bit of a stronger tendency towards the South Asian community from the survivor studies, I think it's balanced out from my second study with the professionals, where I had a lot more representation to hopefully apply more broadly, inshallah.
Thank you, Ramana. I'm also wondering if you have any information on any helplines or support that people could access.
So there is there's a couple of different organisations. In fact, Birmingham used to have a very, very good organisation set up by someone I know. Unfortunately, it doesn't run anymore, which is a bit of a shame. But there's Solace. There's the Muslim Women's Advisory Council. There's another one called Apna Haq. People can Google these and they should be able to find the details. There's the Muslim Community Helpline. There's also, in terms of therapy work, there's the Muslim Counsellor and Psychotherapist Network. They're excellent for finding therapists across the
UK. Yes, Myra has joined us on the show before, so if listeners want to know more information about that organisation, you can listen back to the YouTube channel. Anything else, Ramana, that you wanted to add there?
I think they're the main ones that kind of come to my mind. Thank really.
Thank you very much, Rahmanara and Shanaz, for joining us on the show today and talking about a very sensitive topic. We do encourage all of those who have been affected by listening to this program to please do take the steps to seek support and to confide in your GP if you can. Also, as mentioned earlier in the show, you can catch more mental health information on my Twitter at AtiaAli3, and I'll hope to provide the link to Rahmanara's research. And you can listen back to the show and previous shows on Ramadan Radio's YouTube channel. On one of the previous shows looking at Orange Wolverhampton provides information of local centres that could provide support. Thank you for listening in today. You can hear me next on July the 3rd at 1 p.m, where I'll be speaking to my next guest. Goodbye for now. Assalamu alaikum, and have a lovely rest of the weekend.